surveillance, records provision, national records provision,
national terrorism, records, accountable to warhead,
national terrorism,
surveillance, records, national surveillance, terrorism provision, records, national records provision, surveil of terrorism, surveillance, national terrorism, records, national records provision, surveillance, provision,
national records, surveillance, terrorism, records, provision,
records, terrorism,
national
records, national
records, provision,
records, national
surveillance, terrorism,
records,
terrorism,
surveillance, terrorism, national
provision, terrorism, records, national
terrorism, actionable surveillance, surveilling,
records, provision,
records, provision, records,
provision,
provision,
records,
terrorism,
records, terrorism,
surveillance, national records, surveillance, records,
provision,
record
terrorism, records,
provision, national
terrorism, surveillance,
provision, terrorism, national terrorism,
terrorism,
provision, terrorism,
legislative day.